On November 7, 2024, at 14:23 hours UTC, NASA astronaut Amber Reeves was conducting routine maintenance inside the Columbus Laboratory module of the International Space Station when she found something that should not exist. The station's environmental control system had flagged a corrupted sector in one of the legacy backup servers, hardware dating back to the early 2000s that nobody had physically accessed in over a decade. The repair was supposed to take 20 minutes. Instead, Amber discovered a file directory marked Project Sentinel, classification level Eyes Only, with a purge date listed as January 1964. But the file itself was dated October 12, 1963, and it contained 4 minutes and 17 seconds of audio transmission from a Mercury Redstone mission that, according to every official NASA record, never happened. Amber had been an astronaut for 6 years. MIT Aerospace Engineering, former Air Force test pilot, 2 previous ISS expeditions totaling 311 days in orbit. She knew the Mercury program inside out, 7 missions total. Mercury Redstone 3 through 4, then the orbital flights. The program ended with Mercury Atlas 9 in May 1963. There was no Mercury Redstone 8A. There was no 8th mission. But here was the audio file, complete with NORAD authentication seals and telemetry data showing a capsule reaching an altitude of 247 miles above Earth. Mercury capsules had a maximum operational ceiling of 175 miles. The physics did not work. The G-forces required to reach that altitude with a Redstone booster would have killed any human pilot. Yet, the file existed, sealed in a server that had been orbiting Earth for 14 years, backed up from archives that predated digital storage entirely. She initiated playback through her headset. The transmission opened with standard call signs and timestamps. Launch from Cape Canaveral at 3:14 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Single occupant capsule. And then the voice came through, calm and methodical, exactly the way test pilots are trained to sound when reporting the impossible. Houston, this is Mercury Redstone 8A. I have visual confirmation on unidentified object maintaining parallel orbital trajectory. Distance approximately 7.4 miles. Object is cylindrical. Estimated length 890 feet. No visible propulsion system, no heat signature on infrared. It is matching my orbital velocity exactly. Amber felt her pulse spike. She recognized that voice. Not from NASA training archives, from family videos. From childhood memories of a man she had only known through photographs and her grandmother's stories. The pilot identifying himself as Douglas was her grandfather, Douglas Chen, United States Air Force test pilot who had died in 1964 in what the official reports called a training accident. Except Douglas Chen had never flown for Mercury. His name appeared nowhere in NASA's astronaut rosters. His clearance files were Air Force only, classified under programs that had been redacted even in the Freedom of Information Act releases. Amber paused the playback and pulled up the telemetry overlay. The orbital parameters were precise. Inclination 28.5 degrees, apogee 247 miles, velocity 17,150 miles per hour. But Mercury Redstone 8A had never been assigned a launch window. The trajectory data showed a launch corridor that would have required clearance from both NASA and the Department of Defense, coordination that should have left paper trails across a dozen agencies. Instead, there was nothing. Just this audio file, buried in a backup server that was scheduled for deorbiting and atmospheric destruction in 8 months. If Amber had not found the corrupted sector, if she had not accessed this specific directory, the file would have burned up over the Pacific Ocean without anyone knowing it had ever existed. She thought about her grandfather's death. August 1964. Aircraft malfunction during what the Air Force called a routine training exercise. Closed casket funeral. No investigation. Her grandmother had never talked about it, not in 40 years of asking. Just silence and a framed photograph of a man in a flight suit, smiling at a camera, 3 months before he disappeared. Amber resumed playback. The voice continued, still controlled, still precise. Houston, object is altering position, moving perpendicular to orbital plane. That is not possible without thrust. I repeat, object is moving perpendicular to Earth's gravitational field without any visible propulsion. There was a pause, static. Then the voice again. Houston, are you receiving? Object is now transmitting. Radio frequency, ultra-high band. Pattern is mathematical, not random. This is intentional communication. And then the transmission ended. Not with static or signal loss, just silence. Followed 11 minutes later by a final message. The same voice, but different now. Flat. Emotionless. Houston, this is Mercury Redstone, 8A. Reporting equipment malfunction. All systems nominal. Returning to Earth as scheduled. Amber stopped the recording and stared at the timestamp. October 12, 1963. Her grandfather had died 10 months later. The file had been purged 2 months after that. And now, 61 years later, she was listening to him describe something that violated every principle of orbital mechanics she had ever learned. Something that had been deliberately erased from history. Something that, according to the authentication codes embedded in the metadata, had been classified under the same national security protocols used for nuclear launch sites. Amber made the decision that every astronaut is trained never to make. She copied the file to her personal tablet, encrypted it with a key that NASA could not access, and then she listened to the complete recording from beginning to end. The full transmission was not 4 minutes and 17 seconds. That was just the segment she had initially played. The complete file, including pre-launch communications and the 11-minute silence, ran for 43 minutes and 9 seconds. And what it contained was not a simple equipment malfunction. It was a first contact event that had been systematically erased from human history. The recording opened with launch control communications from Cape Canaveral. The timestamp was precise. 3:14 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, October 12, 1963. The mission designation was Mercury Redstone 8A, and the stated objective was testing an experimental radar system designed to detect Soviet reconnaissance satellites in low Earth orbit. This was the height of the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis had ended just 12 months earlier. The idea of a classified Mercury test flight was not impossible. What was impossible was the flight itself. Douglas Chen's voice came through the static with perfect clarity, running through the pre-ignition checklist with the kind of calm precision that defined the early space program. Pressurization nominal. Fuel flow nominal. Cabin temperature 18.3 degrees Celsius. Heart rate 72 beats per minute. Everything standard. Everything normal. And then the Redstone booster ignited, and the capsule began its ascent into an orbit that should have torn it apart. The telemetry data embedded in the audio file showed acceleration rates that exceeded Mercury design specifications by 47%. The capsule reached maximum dynamic pressure at an altitude where the atmospheric density should have caused catastrophic structural failure. But it held together. And 37 minutes into the flight, while Douglas was conducting the radar test sweep, the impossible happened. The radar return showed an object at 12 kilometers distance, traveling at the same orbital velocity as the capsule, in an orbit that had not existed 6 seconds earlier. Douglas reported it exactly the way he had been trained to report anomalies. No emotion, no speculation, just facts. Houston, I have radar contact on unidentified object. Range 12.0 kilometers. Bearing 270 degrees relative. Object is cylindrical. Estimated dimensions 890 feet in length, 140 feet in diameter. No transponder signal, no radio emissions. Object is matching my orbital parameters with precision that exceeds current tracking capabilities. There was a pause, and then Houston responded. Not with the voice of a flight controller, but with someone whose name was never mentioned, whose position was never identified. The voice simply said, Mercury 8A, maintain radio silence. Do not approach object. Do not attempt visual confirmation. Await instructions. But Douglas Chen had been a test pilot for 11 years before this flight. He had flown experimental aircraft that had killed 7 of his colleagues. He knew when something was wrong with a command structure. He knew when someone who was not supposed to be on the channel was giving orders. And he made the decision that would define the rest of his very short life. He adjusted the capsule's orientation using the reaction control thrusters, rotating the small window toward the object, and he looked at it directly. His description was methodical, technical, and terrifying in its implications. The object had no visible propulsion system, no rocket exhaust, no heat bloom that would indicate any known form of thrust. Yet it was maintaining an orbital position that required constant micro-adjustments to compensate for gravitational variations and atmospheric drag at that altitude. The surface appeared metallic, but did not reflect sunlight the way any human-made material would. And then, as Douglas watched, the object began to move, not along the orbital plane, not following any trajectory that Newton's laws would permit. It moved perpendicular to Earth's gravitational field, accelerating at a rate that Douglas estimated based on radar return changes, at approximately 900 meters per second squared. That is 91.8 times Earth's gravitational acceleration. Any biological crew inside would have been crushed into paste. Any mechanical structure built with 1963 materials, science, would have disintegrated. But the object accelerated smoothly, changed direction without slowing, and then stopped exactly 800 meters from the Mercury capsule. And it began transmitting. Douglas described the transmission in detail. Radio frequency, ultra-high band, wavelength approximately 2.1 centimeters. The signal was pulsed, not continuous, with intervals that formed a mathematical pattern. He counted the pulses. 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21. The Fibonacci sequence. A pattern that appears throughout nature, from spiral galaxies to the arrangement of seeds in a sunflower. A pattern that could not be accidental. A pattern that was, in Douglas Chen's exact words, intentional communication from a non-human intelligence. And then Houston, or whoever was speaking from Houston, cut the transmission. Not with static, not with interference. The audio simply stopped, replaced by silence that lasted exactly 11 minutes and 47 seconds. When the transmission resumed, Douglas Chen's voice had changed. The technical precision was still there, but something else was gone. The curiosity, the wonder, the human element that makes test pilots willing to risk their lives to see what is on the other side of the unknown. He simply stated, "Houston, this is Mercury Redstone 8A. Reporting equipment malfunction in radar system. All capsule systems are nominal. beginning re-entry sequence as scheduled. And that was the end. Splashdown occurred 3 hours and 16 minutes after launch. Recovery was immediate, and according to the file metadata, 4 hours and 32 minutes after Douglas Chen was pulled from the Atlantic Ocean, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara personally called NASA Administrator James Webb with a single instruction. The mission never happened. The pilot is to be placed on immediate medical retirement. All documentation is to be purged within 60 days. Amber stopped the playback and looked at the date of her grandfather's death. August 9, 1964. Exactly 10 months after the flight. Exactly 8 months after the purge order. And the official cause of death was listed as pilot error during a routine training exercise in an aircraft that, according to Air Force maintenance records she had accessed years ago out of simple family curiosity, had undergone a complete safety inspection just 72 hours before the crash. Her grandmother had received a folded flag and a death benefit check. No investigation report, no black box data, no explanation beyond a 2-paragraph letter expressing the Air Force's condolences for her loss. And now, 61 years later, Amber understood why. Her grandfather had not died in a training accident. He had died because he had seen something that the most powerful military on Earth had decided could never be acknowledged. And someone had made sure he would never talk about it again. Amber spent the next 6 hours doing something that violated at least a dozen NASA protocols and possibly several federal laws. She used her privileged access to the ISS communications array to cross-reference the Mercury Redstone 8A file with every database she could reach. Department of Defense Declassified Archives, NORAD tracking records from the early 1960s, even the Library of Congress digital repository of Cold War-era documents that had been released under Freedom of Information Act requests over the past 3 decades. She was not looking for confirmation of her grandfather's mission. She was looking for a pattern. And what she found was worse than she had imagined. Project Sentinel had not been a single flight. It had been a program. And her grandfather's encounter had not been the first. The file structure she discovered was meticulous in its organization and terrifying in its implications. 6 other audio files, all marked Project Sentinel, all with purge dates between January and December 1964. The missions spanned from April 1961 to August 1969. 7 total encounters, 7 pilots, 7 objects with identical specifications. Cylindrical structures, 890 feet in length, 140 feet in diameter. No visible propulsion, moving in ways that violated orbital mechanics, transmitting the same Fibonacci sequence on ultra-high-frequency radio bands. But what made Amber's hands shake as she reviewed the data was not the consistency of the encounters. It was the locations. Each object had appeared at a specific orbital coordinate. And when she plotted those coordinates on a 3-dimensional map of near-Earth space, they formed a perfect geometric pattern. 7 points equally spaced around the planet at an altitude of exactly 247 miles, each separated by precisely 2,847 kilometers. A prime number. Not random. Not coincidental. Deliberate. She cross-referenced those coordinates with current satellite tracking data, using the public access database that amateur astronomers and satellite watchers use to predict ISS flyovers and Starlink trains. 4 of those 7 original coordinates now hosted classified military satellites. NROL designations, which meant National Reconnaissance Office launches that were never publicly detailed. The satellites had been placed in those exact positions between 1997 and 2009, decades after the Project Sentinel encounters. decades after the objects had vanished. But the coordinates were identical down to the meter. That was not a coincidence. That was someone in the Department of Defense maintaining positions that had been identified 60 years earlier. Positions that something non-human had chosen for reasons that no one had ever explained. Amber pulled up the personnel files next, searching for the other pilots who had flown the Sentinel missions. She found 3 of them in the declassified death records. Captain Richard Osborne, United States Air Force, died in a car accident in October 1964. Navy Lieutenant Commander Vincent Harlow died in a training helicopter crash in October 1965. Major Sarah Quantrill, United States Marine Corps, died in a house fire in October 1967. 3 deaths, 3 Octobers, 3 accidents that had occurred exactly 12 months apart, almost to the day. Amber felt her training trying to impose rational explanations. Coincidence? Statistical clustering? Confirmation bias? But test pilots do not die in car accidents at rates higher than the general population. Helicopter crashes during training with experienced pilots and maintained aircraft were rare enough to trigger mandatory investigations. And house fires that killed only 1 occupant, leaving the structure mostly intact, were almost always ruled suspicious. Yet all 3 deaths had been closed as accidental. No follow-up investigations, no questions asked. She found the 4th pilot buried under a false name in a Veterans Affairs long-term care facility outside of Las Vegas, Nevada. Travis Yellen, 91 years old. Listed in the facility directory as a Korean War veteran with no surviving family, admitted in 2012 under a name that did not match any military service records. But when Amber cross-referenced his biometric data from the facility's medical files, data that she absolutely should not have been able to access, but managed to decrypt using an algorithm that a former MIT classmate had designed for entirely different purposes, the fingerprints matched. Travis Yellen had been Captain Travis Yellen, United States Air Force, pilot of the 3rd Project Sentinel mission in November 1962, and he was the only one who had survived past 1971. Amber used the ISS encrypted communication channel, the one reserved for emergency medical consultations with ground-based specialists, to place a video call to the facility. It took 47 minutes to convince the nurse on duty that this was a legitimate family welfare check, and not some kind of scam. When Travis's face appeared on the screen, she saw a man who looked far older than 91. His eyes were clear, but his expression carried the weight of someone who had been waiting for this conversation for 6 decades. She did not waste time with introductions. She simply said, "Mercury Redstone 8A, October 12, 1963. My grandfather was the pilot. I found the files." Travis was quiet for a long time, and then he smiled, and it was the saddest smile Amber had ever seen. "They weren't observing us," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They were installing something, and in 2024, it's almost complete." He explained it in the methodical way that old pilots explain crashes, focusing on the technical details because the emotional weight is too much to carry any other way. The 7 objects that had appeared between 1961 and 1969 were not spacecraft in any traditional sense. They were components, construction modules. Each one had remained in position for approximately 40 minutes, performing some kind of operation that none of the pilots had been able to identify, and then they had vanished. But they had left something behind. Travis described seeing, during his own encounter, a brief shimmer in the space where the object had been, like heat distortion on a summer highway, except this was in the vacuum of space, where heat distortion could not exist. And then it was gone. But the shimmer remained, barely visible, detectable only at certain angles when sunlight hit it in specific ways. He had reported it. The report had been classified, and 2 weeks later, he had been transferred to a desk job in Washington, D.C., where he spent the next 9 years filing paperwork and never flying again. They weren't building a ship, Travis said, his voice gaining strength. They were building a network, something that wraps around the entire Earth. 144 nodes total. We only saw 7 because those were the only ones installed during manned missions. The rest went up when we weren't looking, or when we were looking but didn't understand what we were seeing. And the purpose? He paused, and his expression shifted from sadness to something closer to fear. In December of this year, the network activates fully. And whatever it's designed to do, we're about to find out. Amber was about to ask how he could possibly know the activation date when every screen in the Columbus module went dark simultaneously. Life support continued. The hum of the ventilation system did not change. But every computer interface, every communication panel, every camera and monitoring system shut down as if someone had physically cut the power. Except that was impossible without manual override commands from at least 3 different crew members, and Amber was alone in the module. The darkness lasted 23 minutes. When the systems came back online, there was a message waiting in her encrypted email inbox. No sender identification, no routing data, just a single line of text. Commander Reeves, delete all files immediately. Return to Earth on next available transport. Psychological evaluation mandatory. This is not a request. Amber made a choice that would either end her career or redefine human history. She did not delete the files. Instead, she locked herself in the cupola module, the 7-windowed observatory that offers the most expansive view of Earth and the space surrounding the station, and she began the most important observation session of her life. The ISS carries a suite of external sensors and telescopes designed for Earth observation and astronomical research. Most astronauts use them to photograph auroras and track hurricanes. Amber reprogrammed the entire array to search for something that, according to physics as humanity understood it, should not exist. She input the exact coordinates that Travis had mentioned, the 7 original positions from the Project Sentinel encounters, and she set the sensors to maximum sensitivity, looking for any anomaly, any reflection, any distortion in the space where those objects had appeared 60 years ago. What she found in the first 90 seconds of scanning made her understand why governments had been willing to kill to keep this secret. The structures were still there. Not visible to the naked eye, not detectable by standard radar, but when she filtered the telescope data through wavelengths in the extreme ultraviolet range, they appeared. Reflective surfaces, microscopically thin, forming geometric patterns that caught sunlight at angles that should have been impossible given their orbital positions. They existed in what astronomers call the ionospheric shadow, the region of space where Earth's magnetic field and atmospheric layers create interference that makes ground-based observation nearly impossible. The perfect hiding place. And they were not limited to 7 positions. Amber adjusted the search parameters and expanded the scan to a full orbital sphere around Earth. The array began cataloging returns. 14 nodes, 27 nodes, 63 nodes. The count kept climbing. By the time the scan completed, she was looking at 144 distinct positions, all at precisely 247 miles altitude, all separated by exactly 2,847 kilometers, forming a geodesic network that enclosed the entire planet in a perfect mathematical grid. The engineering required to place structures in those exact positions, to maintain them for 6 decades without any detectable propulsion or course correction, exceeded anything in humanity's current technological capability by margins that Amber could not even calculate. But what terrified her more than the structures themselves was what they were doing. She ran a spectral analysis on the electromagnetic emissions from each node. They were broadcasting, not randomly, not continuously, but in coordinated pulses, timed with microsecond precision, creating interference patterns that rippled through Earth's ionosphere like waves in a pond. The frequency was ultra-high band, the same range that her grandfather had reported in 1963. And the pattern was not the Fibonacci sequence anymore. It was something far more complex, a cascading series of prime number intervals that repeated every 11 minutes and 47 seconds. The same duration as the silence in her grandfather's transmission. The same interval that appeared in every Project Sentinel file. This was not communication. This was calibration. And whatever the network was calibrating for, it was close to completion. Amber pulled up historical data, searching for any correlation between the network's expansion and events on Earth. She started with the dates from the Project Sentinel files and worked forward, cross-referencing with major technological developments, political shifts, and unexplained phenomena. The correlations were subtle at first, easy to dismiss as coincidence, but the pattern held across decades with statistical significance that made coincidence impossible. November 1963, the 7th node activated according to the Sentinel files. 3 weeks later, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. July 1969, reports from amateur radio operators in Australia documented unusual electromagnetic interference during the Apollo 11 moon landing. The interference caused a 2.3-second delay in the live broadcast that NASA never adequately explained. The timing matched perfectly with what would have been the installation of additional nodes beyond the original 7. 2011, multiple nodes showed increased activity according to Amber's analysis of archived ionospheric data. That same year, the Arab Spring erupted simultaneously across a dozen countries. Protests coordinated through social media with a speed and synchronization that political scientists still cannot fully explain. And now, 2024, the network was approaching what the data suggested was full operational capacity. The activation date that Travis had mentioned, December of this year, was exactly 41 days away. Amber ran calculations on the network's potential function based on its geometry and emissions profile. If the nodes were designed to modulate electromagnetic signals passing through the ionosphere, they could theoretically influence any communication system on Earth: radio, television, internet infrastructure, satellite networks. Not by blocking signals, but by introducing subtle variations, microsecond delays, frequency shifts too small for standard equipment to detect but large enough to alter the content of digital transmissions. Humanity's entire information infrastructure could be compromised, manipulated, rewritten in real time, and no one would know because the changes would propagate faster than human perception could track them. The implications were staggering. Every digital communication for the past 60 years could have been influenced. Every decision made based on electronic data could have been guided by something that was not human. And in 41 days, whatever had been building this network for 6 decades would have complete control. She was processing this horror, trying to formulate a plan, when her communication headset activated without her touching any controls. The voice that came through was not anyone from Houston. It was not anyone she recognized. It was calm, measured, and spoke with the kind of certainty that comes from absolute authority. "Commander Reeves, Your grandfather completed his mission exactly as intended. The network was always meant to be discovered. Not in 1963. Now. You were selected for this expedition 3 years before you applied to NASA. Your genetic profile is unique. 0.003% of the human population carries the neurological structure required to perceive the network's true function without experiencing permanent cognitive damage. Douglas Chen carried that same structure. So does Travis Yellen. So do you. This conversation is not a negotiation. You will listen, you will understand, and you will make a choice that will determine whether your species survives the next 41 days. Every system in the ISS shut down simultaneously. Life support, communications, navigation, internal lighting. For 90 seconds, Amber floated in absolute darkness and silence, 354 kilometers above Earth, in a station that had not experienced a complete power failure in its entire 26-year operational history. When the lights returned, she was alone. The 2 other crew members who had been aboard the station, a Russian cosmonaut named Dmitry and a Japanese astronaut named Keiko, were gone. Their personal tablets were still in the habitation module, their sleep restraints were still configured for occupancy, but the emergency evacuation protocol showed no Soyuz departure, no emergency escape in the crew return vehicle, no record of any activity at all. The station's internal cameras, when Amber reviewed the footage from the past 90 seconds, showed only static. And when she looked out the cupola windows toward the section of the station where Dmitry and Keiko should have been, she saw them. Still there. Still moving through their normal routines. But when she called out over the intercom, there was no response. They could not hear her. Or they were not really there anymore. And she had no way to tell which possibility was worse. Amber made the kind of decision that astronauts are specifically trained never to make under stress. But she was no longer operating under normal circumstances. She accessed the ISS Backup Communications Array, the redundant system designed for emergency contact if primary channels failed, and she began uploading everything. The Project Sentinel files, the telemetry data, the spectral analysis of the network, the coordinates of all 144 nodes. The audio recording of her grandfather's transmission, the conversation with Travis, every piece of evidence she had accumulated over the past 18 hours. She sent it to 47 different servers simultaneously. Independent news organizations, university research departments, amateur astronomy forums, even conspiracy theory websites that she would never have considered credible under normal circumstances. The upload took 12 minutes. And in that 12 minutes, she understood that she was ending her career, possibly her freedom, and potentially her life. But the alternative was allowing something that had controlled human communication for 60 years to remain hidden for even one more day. NASA's official response came exactly 14 minutes after the upload completed. A press release distributed to every major media outlet simultaneously. NASA astronaut commander Amber Reeves is experiencing acute space-related psychological distress and will be returning to Earth on the next available transport for comprehensive medical evaluation. The files circulating online are a combination of corrupted data and fabricated material. NASA takes the mental health of our astronauts seriously and asks the public to respect Commander Reeves's privacy during this difficult time. The statement was professional, sympathetic, and completely effective at framing everything she had released as the delusions of someone who had been in space too long. But it was also too fast. 14 minutes was not enough time for NASA administrators to review the files, consult with Department of Defense liaisons, coordinate with public affairs, and draft an official response. The statement had been prepared in advance. They had been waiting for her to do exactly what she did. And that realization was somehow worse than the network itself. The files went viral anyway. 180 million views in the first 4 hours. Analysis from independent audio forensics experts. Astronomers confirming the coordinates and detecting the nodes with their own equipment. Former intelligence officers providing context about Cold War-era classification protocols. The discussion exploded across every platform, and for 72 hours it seemed like Amber had succeeded in forcing the truth into public awareness. And then the counter-narrative appeared. Metadata analysis from 3 separate cybersecurity firms showing that the original Project Sentinel files had been created recently, not in 1963. Digital fingerprints indicating the audio had been synthesized using advanced AI voice cloning technology. The files had been planted in the ISS server 3 weeks before Amber found them, inserted during a routine software update that left traces in the system logs. The evidence was incontrovertible. The files were fake. They had been manufactured and placed exactly where Amber would find them, designed to look authentic, designed to trigger the exact response she had given. But the spectral analysis of her grandfather's voice showed something different. Audio formant frequencies, the physical characteristics of human vocal cords, matched perfectly with recordings of Douglas Chen from 1963. Deepfake technology, even the most advanced systems available in 2024, could not replicate formant structures with that level of accuracy. The voice was real, but the file containing it was fake. The paradox made no sense until Travis sent his final message. It arrived in Amber's encrypted email 3 days after she returned to Earth, during the 72-hour debriefing that felt more like an interrogation. The message was time-stamped 6 hours after major news outlets reported that Travis Yellen had died of a heart attack in his sleep at the Nevada Care Facility. No family, no funeral, body cremated per his previously stated wishes. But the email was authenticated with encryption keys that only Travis possessed, keys that had been generated during their original conversation and could not be duplicated. The message was short. The network was not built by them. It was built by us, 400 years in the future. It is a quantum Ansible, a device for instantaneous communication across time. Project Sentinel was a test to see if past iteration humans could detect it. You were chosen because your genetics allow you to perceive temporal communication without permanent neurological damage. The same genetics your grandfather had. The message the network will transmit in December is not from an alien intelligence. It is from human survivors in a future where we did not detect this network in time, where we did not understand what it meant, and where we made choices that ended our species. This is the last iteration of the loop. You can convince humanity to deactivate the network and prevent the message from arriving, severing our connection to that doomed timeline, or you can allow the transmission, perpetuating the cycle that leads to our extinction. The choice is yours. But know this: every iteration before this one, you chose to let it transmit. And every time, we ended the same way. Amber was released from NASA custody after 72 hours with no charges filed and a strong recommendation that she take 6 months of medical leave. The official investigation into cybersecurity protocols was ongoing. The public had mostly moved on to other scandals and catastrophes, but the network remained detectable for anyone with the right equipment and the persistence to look. Amateur astronomers confirmed the coordinates. The nodes were real, whatever their origin. And Travis's death certificate listed the cause as natural, but there was no body to examine, no autopsy performed, and his family which supposedly did not exist, could not be located for comment. December was now 11 days away, and Amber had no idea what she was supposed to do. Deactivating a network that had been in place for 60 years would require governmental cooperation that she clearly did not have. Allowing it to transmit meant potentially receiving a message from a future that was trying to prevent its own extinction. But if the message itself was part of the loop that caused the extinction, then receiving it would guarantee the outcome they were trying to avoid. The temporal paradox made her head hurt in ways that 6 years of aerospace engineering had never prepared her for. She gave one final interview, unauthorized and unscripted, to an independent journalist who had been covering the story since the beginning. When asked what she believed, Amber said, "The question is not whether we are alone in the universe. The question is whether we are trapped in a loop of our own making, repeating the same mistakes across iterations of time, and whether the only way to break that cycle is to trust a message from ourselves that we have no way to verify. It requires faith. Not in God, not in aliens, but in future versions of ourselves who are desperate enough to reach backward through time to save us. And I do not know if that faith is wisdom or madness." 3 weeks later, Amber deleted all her social media accounts, resigned from NASA, and disappeared from public view. December came and went. No catastrophic event occurred. No message from the future was detected. The network remained in orbit, silent and waiting. And humanity continued forward, unaware or uncaring that something had been built around their planet by hands they could not identify, for purposes they could not understand. The only certainty was that somewhere, in 41 days or 400 years, someone was watching to see what choice would be made. And whether this time, finally, it would be different.